Zane Carter had always lived a simple life in the quiet suburbs, where the biggest excitement was the occasional neighbor drama or a lawnmower that refused to start. A tall, average guy with a bit of a sarcastic streak, Zane was the type who'd rather be left alone with his books and his remote than get caught up in anything too complicated. But that all changed one cold winter night. He was just finishing a late-night snack in his kitchen, a half-eaten sandwich on the counter, when a loud boom shook the house. The sound was deafening, like a meteor hitting the ground, rattling the windows and sending his heart into overdrive. Zane froze, staring at the walls, wondering if there had been some kind of explosion nearby. The lights flickered, and then, nothing. He quickly shoved open the back door, his breath misting in the air, and stumbled into the backyard. There in the middle of the lawn lay a smoking crater. The once neatly trimmed grass was torn apart, singed and scorched. In the middle of the crater was something Zane had only ever seen in movies, a sleek, black, metallic object. The thing resembled an escape pod, the kind you'd expect to see in a space movie. His heart pounded. This was no firework or neighbor prank. Something big had just landed in his backyard. Zane's first instinct was to call the cops, but then he paused. What if this was something really out of the ordinary? Was he really ready to deal with whatever alien nonsense might be going on here? Against his better judgment, Zane took a few steps forward. He had to see it for himself. The pod's surface was slick, reflecting the dim light of the moon as Zane approached it cautiously. Then, with a whoosh, the hatch slid open. Out stepped a woman, or at least someone who looked like a woman, though nothing about her seemed entirely human. Her skin was a striking shade of silver, shimmering faintly in the night, as if covered by a thin layer of stardust. She was tall, much taller than Zane, with sharp, angular features that looked like they belonged in a foreign, distant world. Her hair was long and dark, cascading down her back like liquid midnight. Her eyes were the most unexpected part, violet, glowing faintly, and filled with a sense of authority Zane had never seen before. Before Zane could react, she took one long look at him, her eyes narrowing, and then spoke in perfect English. "I require sanctuary." Zane blinked. Was he hearing things? Had he just woken up in some sci-fi fantasy? He wanted to run, to call for help, but his legs felt like they were glued to the ground. He swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the situation. The woman stepped closer, her presence oddly calming despite the obvious danger of her sudden appearance. "My name is Vekra Shelzor. I come from a distant galaxy. I need refuge from those who would see me dead. You are my only hope." She said it with such quiet confidence that Zane couldn't help but stare. "Refuge? You? Wait a minute, what do you mean dead?" Zane stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He had no idea what to think, no idea how to process the wildest thing he'd ever seen in his life. Vekra took a step forward. "The Bounty Guild is after me. If they find me, it will mean my end. Please, I need your help." Zane's mind raced. He wasn't sure if he should run, or if he should just wake up from this bizarre dream. But before he could decide, Vekra did something that made the decision for him. She took a deep breath and, without another word, walked past him and into his house, as if she had every right to do so. "I'm sorry, but I'm staying here," she declared, as if she had just chosen her new home, and Zane had no say in the matter. Zane stood in his backyard, staring after her. "What did I just get myself into?" he muttered, but deep down, he knew he wasn't going to turn her away. After all, who could resist helping an alien warrior who had just crash-landed in his backyard? And so began the strange new chapter in Zane's life. Little did he know, it would change everything. Zane stood in his kitchen, staring at the empty doorway where the alien woman had just walked in. He had no idea what was going on. He'd heard stories about UFOs and aliens on late-night talk shows, but this was real, and it was happening in his own home. He rubbed his face with both hands, hoping that maybe this was some crazy dream. But when he opened his eyes, she was still there. He heard footsteps echoing from the living room, and then the sound of something metallic being dropped. He hurried into the next room, his heart pounding. Vekra Shelzor was standing in the middle of the living room, taking off her strange, black armor. Zane could barely believe what he was seeing. The suit was covered in glowing lines and markings that pulsed faintly, almost like it was alive. He'd never seen anything like it before. "But you can't just walk in here and make yourself at home," Zane said, trying to sound confident, even though his voice cracked. "I'm gonna need some answers. Fast." Vekra didn't even look at him. She was busy unstrapping pieces of her armor, her movements graceful and efficient, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. "I've already told you, I need sanctuary," she said in her calm, smooth voice. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't worried. She wasn't anything like Zane had expected. He had imagined an alien invasion, maybe some glowing-eyed monster that would zap him on sight. But instead, here was a woman who, despite her terrifying presence, seemed oddly human. Zane ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I heard you the first time. But do you think maybe you could explain what's going on?" Vekra stopped what she was doing and finally turned her violet eyes toward him. There was something about the way she looked at him, a steady, unwavering gaze that made Zane feel like he was under the scrutiny of something much older and wiser than himself. "I am not like your people," Vekra said. "My people are warriors from a distant galaxy, and I am hunted by those who want to see me dead. I've been on the run for weeks. If I stay outside, they'll find me. This house is the only place they won't look." Zane blinked. "Wait, you're telling me you're running from some kind of intergalactic bounty hunters?" Vekra nodded. "Yes. That's a lot to take in. And you're staying here with me?" Zane asked, incredulous. "I don't even know what you are. And what's with the glowing armor? Are you some sword off?" "I am a Zorathi," she interrupted, her voice not unkind but firm. "And my armor is a part of me, a tool I use to protect myself. Now it is discarded." She let the last piece of armor clink to the floor. Zane gaped. "What? No, thank you for letting you crash in my backyard. No, sorry for bringing an alien war on your doorstep." Vekra didn't seem to catch the sarcasm in his tone. She walked toward the kitchen without a second glance at him, opened the fridge, and began scanning through the shelves. Zane followed, still trying to process everything. "I'll need sustenance," Vekra said simply, pulling out a jug of orange juice and taking a long gulp from the bottle. Zane couldn't help but stare. Maybe you could use a glass," he suggested. But she didn't respond. She just kept drinking. Zane shook his head. Okay. Fine. You can stay here. But the second those bounty hunter people show up, I'm locking you out. Got it?" Vekra finally lowered the juice and gave him a small, almost amused look. "You will not be able to lock me out," she said with quiet certainty. "But for now, I will respect your space." Zane stood there, utterly confused, but also oddly captivated by this alien woman who had invaded his life. Was he really just going to let her stay? She was clearly dangerous. She probably brought more trouble than he could handle, and yet there was something in her eyes that made him believe she wasn't here to hurt him. He sighed and leaned against the counter. "This is insane," he muttered to himself. "Thank you for your hospitality, Zane Carter," Vekra said, her voice still calm, but now with a hint of respect. "You are my ally now, whether you wish it or not." Zane was about to argue, but he knew that would be pointless. He had no choice but to accept it. He was stuck with an alien warrior who didn't seem to have any concept of personal space, but he couldn't help wondering, what if this was the beginning of something far more dangerous than he could ever imagine? And just like that, Zane's normal life was over. It had been replaced with something far stranger and far more exciting. The next few days in Zane's life were nothing short of chaotic. At first, he thought he could handle it. After all, How hard could it be to have a mysterious, powerful alien living under his roof? But quickly, he realized just how wrong he was. Vecra Shelzor wasn't your typical houseguest. She didn't need a bed. She slept sitting up, her back against the wall, her eyes wide open, alert at all times. She didn't need to cook or eat much, though when she did, it was a bit of an experience. The way she would devour an entire pizza in a matter of seconds was both impressive and terrifying. And when she wasn't eating, she was training. Every day without fail, she would perform bizarre, fluid combat routines in the living room, using moves Zane had never seen before. He couldn't help but watch, mesmerized by the precision and strength she exhibited. Zane had hoped that by the third day, things would settle into some sort of routine. But that hope was quickly dashed. The first sign of trouble came one evening when Zane arrived home from work to find the entire neighborhood in a state of panic. Cars were parked haphazardly on the street, and people were standing outside their houses, looking confused and worried. Zane's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. He didn't even have to ask what was going on. As soon as he stepped out of his car, Vecra appeared beside him, her expression dark and intense. "They found me," she said in a low, controlled voice. "Who? What's happening?" Zane asked, his pulse racing. "The Bounty Guild," Vecra answered, her eyes scanning the area. "They've sent a tracking team to Earth. They'll stop at nothing to capture me." Zane's head spun. He had a sinking feeling that his quiet life was about to get a lot more complicated. "What do we do?" "We prepare," Vecra said simply. Before Zane could respond, he saw them. Two men walking down the street, dressed in strange, sleek suits, as if they didn't belong in a suburban neighborhood at all. They were scanning every house with a small device in their hands, looking for something, or someone. Zane froze, his stomach dropping. He had no idea how, but he knew, deep down, that they were looking for Vecra. Vecra's eyes narrowed. Without warning, she grabbed Zane's arm and pulled him inside. The door slammed shut behind them, and she wasted no time. "Stay here. Do not open the door. No matter what." Zane didn't have time to argue. He watched in silence as Vecra moved quickly through the house, her sharp movements almost too fast for his eyes to follow. She pulled a long silver blade from under her jacket, a weapon unlike anything he'd ever seen before. It shimmered in the light, and Zane could feel the power it radiated. "We can't let them get close," Vecra said, her voice steady, but there was a dangerous edge to it now. "If they capture me, they'll destroy everything you know." Before Zane could respond, there was a loud bang on the front door. Then another, and another. The bounty hunters had arrived. Vecra motioned for Zane to stay quiet, then moved silently toward the door. Zane's heart was pounding in his chest as he watched her, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait. The door shook with each pounding knock, and Zane realized just how real this situation was. There was no going back now. He was in this. Suddenly, Vecra stood in front of the door, blade in hand, her posture calm and deadly. She waited, her eyes locked on the handle, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The door splintered as one of the bounty hunters kicked it in. What happened next was a blur. Vecra moved with lightning speed, her blade flashing as she expertly took down the first man who entered. He never even saw it coming. The second one was quicker, but not quick enough. Zane's breath caught in his throat as he watched the alien warrior disarm the intruder with ease, sending him crashing to the floor. The two men, now on the ground, groaned, but Vecra wasn't done. She turned to Zane and gave him a quick, intense look. "Stay here. I will handle this." Zane's mind was racing, his thoughts spinning. He'd never seen anyone fight like that before, like a living weapon. She wasn't just an alien. She was something else. Outside, he could hear more footsteps. He had no idea how many more were out there, but one thing was clear. The bounty hunters were just getting started. And no matter what happened next, Zane knew his life would never be the same again. The chaos outside Zane's house had only just begun. After Vecra swiftly neutralized the two bounty hunters who had broken in, Zane was left standing in the living room, trying to catch his breath. He hadn't even realized how fast his heart was racing until he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. He didn't have much time to think before the front door opened with a forceful bang. A team of government agents stormed into the house, dressed in black tactical gear with the letters EAB emblazoned on their chests. Zane barely had time to process their arrival before one of them spoke. "Stay back, civilian," the agent said, his voice cold and commanding. Zane's hands shot up instinctively, but his eyes were locked on Vecra. She stood tall, unfazed by the sudden intrusion. "Zane Carter?" Another agent asked, his gaze scanning the room. "Yeah, that's me. But I'm not sure what's going on here," Zane replied, feeling more confused than ever. One of the agents, a tall woman with short blonde hair, stepped forward. "You're involved now, Mr. Carter, and you're in danger. We need you to step aside." "Danger?" Zane repeated, his mind still spinning. "What do you mean by?" Before he could finish, Vecra spoke, her voice firm. "I've already told you I need sanctuary, and you promised to keep me safe." Her words rang out with a calm yet forceful authority that made Zane uneasy but oddly reassured. The agents exchanged uneasy glances. "You don't understand," the woman agent said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Vecra. "The situation has escalated beyond anything you're prepared for. You're now a target of the Bureau. We've been tracking your movements for the past 3 days, and we know the Bounty Guild has marked you. If they get you—" She hesitated. "The consequences for this planet will be catastrophic." Zane glanced from Vecra to the agents, still not fully grasping what was happening. "So, what? You want me to just hand her over to you?" Zane's voice came out sharper than he intended, but it felt like the only thing he could say in the whirlwind of events. "No," the agent with the blonde hair responded, "but we have to move fast. The moment you're in our custody, they'll find you. And once they track your location, they'll bring a full-scale invasion to Earth. You'll both be destroyed." The weight of her words hit Zane like a punch to the gut. He was in deep now. There was no way out. Vecra stepped forward, her posture still relaxed, but her eyes sharp. "I will not surrender. I will not run from this fight." Zane looked between her and the agents, his mind racing. The Bureau, whoever they were, clearly knew more than he did. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had just gotten himself into by helping Vecra. But at the same time, he couldn't bring himself to turn his back on her. She wasn't just some alien. There was something in the way she carried herself, an undeniable strength and purpose that made Zane believe she was fighting for something more than just her own survival. "We can protect you," the agent offered again, her tone softer now, almost pleading. "But we need your cooperation, Zane. You're in this whether you like it or not." Zane ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts a whirlwind. "I'm not letting you take her," he said finally, his voice steady, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince them or himself. The agents didn't respond immediately. Instead, the woman agent took a deep breath and nodded. In an instant, the agents split up, one of them moving toward a back room, and the others closing in on Zane and Vecra. Zane instinctively took a step back, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what the agents had in mind, but something told him this wasn't going to end peacefully. "We're not here to fight," the agent in front of him said, her voice low but stern. "But if you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to force your cooperation. You have to understand, we're trying to protect you both." Zane looked over at Vecra, who stood silently by his side. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes, something that made him believe there was more at stake than just her survival. She wasn't only trying to escape a bounty guild. She was protecting something or someone much bigger than that. And Zane suddenly realized he wasn't just caught up in some random alien drama. He was in the middle of something that could change the future of Earth itself. The woman agent stepped forward, her eyes scanning Vecra. "This is your last chance. We're here to help. Don't make us bring you in by force." Zane could feel the tension in the room thickening. The decision wasn't just about whether he could trust the agents anymore. It was about whether or not he could trust himself, and whether he was willing to fight for something far greater than his own safety. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm. He turned to Vecra. "And neither is she." Zane's heart was still racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. The tension in the room was thick, heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He had just declared war on the Bureau, a shadowy government organization that seemed to hold all the power. If they wanted him to cooperate, they were going to have to force him. And by extension, force Vecra. But that wasn't going to happen. He stood his ground, even though every instinct told him he was walking into something much bigger than he could handle. Vecra was at his side, her calm presence oddly comforting in the face of so many unknowns. He didn't know how she had gotten mixed up in all this, but what he did know was that he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The agents were not happy. The blonde woman who had been doing most of the talking took a deep breath, her eyes flashing with frustration. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice sharp. "The moment you refuse our protection, you're putting yourself, and the entire planet, in danger. We cannot allow you to become a target for the Bounty Guild. Do you understand that?" Zane met her gaze squarely. "I don't care about the guild or whatever they are. You're not taking her." Vecra stood silently beside him, not saying a word, but Zane could feel the silent understanding between them. She was with him. And for the first time in days, Zane felt like he was doing something that mattered. Maybe it was reckless, maybe it was stupid, but it was the right thing to do. The agents exchanged tense looks, the silence stretching on until it felt suffocating. Zane could feel the weight of their collective gaze on him, but he wasn't backing down. He was done with being afraid. "We don't have time for this," the agent with dark hair and glasses muttered, his voice low. "If the bounty hunters are this close, we need to move." The blonde agent hesitated, then turned to Zane. "You don't understand, do you?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost pitying. "You're fighting a battle you cannot win. These people are not just bounty hunters. They're part of something much worse. If they catch her, they will bring their war to Earth, and the consequences for you will be disastrous. We are trying to protect you, Mr. Carter, but if you keep standing in our way, you'll make it worse." Zane shook his head, frustration building. "I don't want your protection," he said, his voice firm. "You don't get it. I'm not leaving her behind. I promised to help her, and I'm not going back on that now. If you want to fight us, then so be it. But don't act like I'm the one making a mistake here." For a moment, the room was still. Then, to Zane's surprise, the blonde agent exhaled deeply, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "Fine," she said, her tone less forceful. "We won't take her from you, but you're making a dangerous enemy, Carter. The Bounty Guild doesn't give second chances." Zane didn't know if that was supposed to be a threat or a warning, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were finally backing off. Slowly, the agents began to retreat, still watching Zane and Vecra carefully. The room seemed to relax just a little, but Zane knew this was far from over. As the last agent left, the blonde woman turned to Zane one final time. "You're on your own now, but if you need us..." She didn't finish, her voice trailing off as she left, her team following her. The door clicked shut behind them, and Zane let out a breath he didn't even realize he'd been holding. He turned to Vecra, who was still standing there, her face impassive. "So, what now?" he asked, trying to catch his breath. "They'll be back, won't they?" Vecra nodded, her expression unchanged. "Yes, they will return with greater force. But now you understand. This is not just about me anymore. It's about protecting your world from something far greater than you can imagine." Zane swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had no idea what kind of war they were about to be pulled into, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Vecra face it alone. As he looked out the window, the gravity of the situation hit him harder than ever. Whatever the Bureau was, whatever the Bounty Guild was, they were all headed for Earth, and Zane had just made himself a target. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. "This isn't over," Zane said quietly, turning back to Vecra. "I'm with you. Whatever happens next, we face it together." Vecra finally allowed herself a small nod, a rare flicker of gratitude passing across her features. "I will not forget this, Zane Carter. You've made a powerful ally today." Zane smiled grimly. "I hope you're right." And with that, the next chapter of their dangerous alliance began. Days passed, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of Zane's stomach never went away. The Bureau's warning echoed in his mind, and Vecra's words haunted him even more. He had no idea what kind of danger they were facing, but he was certain of one thing. Their lives would never be the same again. The quiet suburban life he had known was slipping away, replaced by something far more dangerous and unpredictable. And yet, there was no turning back. Zane's apartment had become their base of operations, if one could even call it that. Vecra, though she was more of a warrior than a strategist, had insisted on setting up a series of defensive measures. Every corner of the apartment was carefully assessed, every window reinforced, every entry point covered. Zane couldn't help but be amazed at how someone with so little earthly knowledge could set things up with such precision. Her skills were unparalleled, and yet she never boasted about them. She simply did what was necessary, as if this was her reality. Every day, Vecra trained in the living room, refining her combat techniques with an intensity Zane couldn't fully comprehend. She didn't need a gym or fancy equipment. All she needed was space and focus. Zane watched her, day after day, as she moved with fluid grace, her body in constant motion. He wondered, not for the first time, what kind of life she had led before she ended up on Earth. Who had she been before the Bounty Guild came after her? It wasn't just her fighting skills that fascinated Zane. It was her resilience. She had been through so much, yet she remained unbroken. Vecra's past was a mystery, but he knew it wasn't something she was willing to share. She didn't want sympathy, and she certainly didn't need it. She only wanted safety, and she had made it clear that Zane was now a part of that equation. He wasn't just helping her survive. He had become her ally, whether he liked it or not. Zane had his own questions, though. Why had the Bureau gotten involved in the first place? What made Vecra so important? Was she really just running from bounty hunters, or was there something bigger at play? Every time he asked, Vecra would give him a cryptic answer, something about not being able to explain until the time was right. It wasn't that she was secretive. It was that the truth was dangerous. So dangerous, in fact, that sharing it could get them both killed. One evening, as the sun began to set, Zane sat at the small kitchen table, staring out the window, lost in thought. The sound of Vecra's movements stopped, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes studying him. "Do you regret this?" Vecra asked, her voice low. She rarely asked such direct questions, but something in her tone made Zane pause. He leaned back in his chair, considering her question carefully. He could feel the weight of everything on his shoulders. He had been dragged into a world of danger, a world he didn't understand. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the sense of purpose that had come with it. Vecra wasn't just some alien. She had become something more to him, a friend, a companion, someone he couldn't abandon. "No," he said finally, his voice steady. "I don't regret it. But I don't know what happens next. I don't know what we're up against, Vecra." Her gaze softened for a moment, and for the first time since they had met, Zane saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same focused determination. "Whatever happens next," she said, "we face it together. We are stronger than they realize." Zane nodded. "I'm with you." We'll figure it out." The air between them was thick with the unspoken bond that had formed over the past few days. There was no going back now. They had chosen each other, and nothing, not even the threat of the Bureau or the Bounty Guild, could tear them apart. As Zane returned to his thoughts, Vecra turned and moved toward the window, her sharp eyes scanning the street below. There was no telling when the next wave of danger would come, but Zane knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, he would fight for her. For them both. And somewhere deep down, he realized that whatever this was, this strange alliance between a human and an alien, it had become more than just survival. It had become a fight for something greater. A fight for the future of their world, and a fight for each other. Zane couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than they had prepared for. It had been a week since the Bureau left his apartment, and while he tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the fact that danger was always lurking just around the corner. Vecra's warnings echoed in his mind. The Bounty Guild won't stop. They'll send more. But what was he supposed to do? He wasn't a soldier. He was just a regular guy who had somehow become involved in a fight that wasn't his. The apartment had become their temporary fortress, but even with all the precautions Vecra had put in place, Zane couldn't shake the unease. She was always so calm, always so focused, but there were moments when even she would pause, her eyes scanning the room as if listening to something that Zane couldn't hear. Every once in a while, when she thought he wasn't looking, Zane would catch her staring out the window, her expression unreadable. It was during one of those quiet moments, when Zane was sitting on the couch with his laptop open, that he noticed something unusual. Vecra had gone silent, her training session abruptly stopping. Zane glanced up and saw her moving toward the window again, this time with a purposeful speed. Her eyes narrowed, and Zane could feel the tension in the room shift. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low. He stood up from the couch, his instincts kicking in. He had learned to trust Vecra's intuition, even when he didn't understand it. Vecra didn't answer right away. She was still staring out the window, her hand resting on the edge of the sill. Zane moved to stand beside her, looking out into the street. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, too peaceful, but something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, like the calm before a storm. Then he saw it. A black car parked down the street, just outside his line of sight. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out like a sore thumb. It was too far away for him to see the driver, but the vehicle's tinted windows and the way it just sat there made Zane's stomach drop. "That's them," Vecra said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Zane turned to her, his heart racing. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Bounty Guild," she replied, her voice steady, but laced with an edge of urgency. "They're here. They found us." Zane felt a chill run down his spine. He had known this day would come, but now that it was here, he realized just how unprepared they were. His apartment wasn't a fortress. It was a trap. The Guild had found them, and they weren't going to let them go so easily. "What do we do?" Zane asked, his voice tight. His mind was racing, but he had no clear plan. He was out of his depth. Vecra turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "We need to move. Now." Without wasting another second, she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the back door. Zane stumbled for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden urgency, but he quickly recovered and followed her. As they made their way through the narrow hallway, Zane's heart was pounding in his chest. The sound of the car outside seemed to grow louder, and he could feel the weight of it pressing on him. They reached the back door, and Vecra paused, her hand on the doorknob. She looked at Zane, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, Zane thought he saw a flicker of something like regret in her eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that familiar determination. "Stay close," she said. "Don't make a sound." Zane nodded, though he wasn't sure how well he could follow her instructions. The adrenaline was starting to kick in, and he felt like his mind was moving a mile a minute. They couldn't escape out the back without being seen, but they didn't have much of a choice. Vecra opened the door just enough to slip through, and Zane followed closely. As they reached the street corner, Zane could hear the sound of footsteps behind them. His blood ran cold. The guild was closing in. They weren't going to let them slip away so easily. Zane's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. They had to get out of sight, and fast. "We need to split up," Vecra said, her voice low but firm. "I'll draw them away. You head to the old storage building 2 blocks down. I'll meet you there." Zane's heart skipped a beat. "Wait, you're going alone?" Vecra's eyes met his, and for the first time, Zane saw a flicker of vulnerability. "I'm not leaving you behind," she said simply, her voice steady. "But you need to trust me." Zane didn't have time to argue. He knew she was right. This was their only chance. "I'll see you at the storage building," he said, his voice tight with determination. With that, they parted ways, each of them vanishing into the shadows as the Bounty Guild closed in. Zane didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This fight was far from over. Zane's heart was pounding as he sprinted down the alley, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he kept moving, forcing his legs to carry him faster. The sound of pursuit was close, too close. He didn't know if Vecra had managed to distract the guild members long enough, but he had to trust her. She was tough, tougher than anyone he'd ever known, but even she couldn't take on an entire guild by herself. He turned the corner sharply, his mind racing with thoughts of where to go, how to lose them. The storage building wasn't far, but Zane knew it wouldn't be enough to hide there forever. His only hope was to get there, secure the area, and wait for Vecra. If she didn't show up soon, he would have to come up with another plan. Zane slowed his pace as he neared the building, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of the guild. The coast seemed clear, too clear. It made his stomach twist with unease. They were good at this. He'd seen it in their eyes when they first confronted him. They weren't amateurs. They would be coming for him soon, and he didn't have much time. As he approached the back of the storage building, Zane carefully tested the door. It creaked open, and he slipped inside, staying low. His senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the stillness. He moved quickly, heading toward the far corner where he could hide and keep an eye on the street. The shadows were thick here, but Zane wasn't about to take any chances. He crouched down, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, and tried to steady his breathing. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Zane's mind kept drifting back to Vecra. Had she made it out? Was she safe? He didn't want to think about what would happen if she hadn't. He had promised to help her, to fight alongside her, but now that they were separated, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of footsteps. Zane's heart stopped. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows, willing himself to become part of the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He could hear them talking, but their voices were muffled by the thick walls of the building. "Spread out," a voice ordered. It was one of the bounty hunters. "She can't have gone far." Zane held his breath. He knew they were getting closer. He could almost feel the heat of their bodies, the anticipation in the air. The hunters were skilled, methodical. They wouldn't give up easily. Zane's eyes darted around, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. But there was nothing. Just metal shelves and boxes stacked haphazardly. His only advantage was the element of surprise. He couldn't let them find him. Not yet. Not until Vecra was safe. A few seconds later, the sound of footsteps faded, and Zane allowed himself to exhale. They had passed him by, at least for now, but they would circle back. He had to move, had to make sure they didn't find him. He slipped out from behind the corner, his movements slow and calculated. The back door to the building was his best shot at escape. If he could get out and stay ahead of them, maybe he could find Vecra and help her. Maybe together, they could finally take the fight to the guild and end this once and for all. Suddenly, A voice rang out, sharp and clear. "He's here. I see him." Zane's heart skipped a beat. They had spotted him. Without thinking, he bolted for the back door. But before he could reach it, a hand grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Zane spun around, ready to fight. But the moment his eyes locked with the person holding him, he froze. It wasn't one of the bounty hunters. It was Vecra. She was panting, her face flushed. But there was relief in her eyes when she saw him. Zane's pulse slowed, and he felt the tension leave his body. "Get down," Vecra hissed, pulling him to the ground just as the sound of footsteps drew nearer. Zane barely had time to react before Vecra's body was shielding. "Wait for my signal," she whispered, her breath steady despite the situation. "When I move, you run." Zane didn't hesitate. He trusted her. He had no choice but to trust her. As the footsteps grew louder, Zane braced himself for whatever came next. He had no idea how they were going to get out of this, but with Vecra at his side, he knew they stood a chance. Then, without warning, Vecra sprang into action. She dove from behind the cover, knocking one of the bounty hunters to the ground and quickly disarming him. The others hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden attack. Zane took the opportunity to sprint for the back door, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back. As he reached the door and burst outside into the cool night air, he knew they were far from safe. But for the first time since this nightmare had started, Zane felt a glimmer of hope. They were alive. They were still in the fight, and together, they would find a way to win. Zane's legs burned as he ran, the cold night air biting at his skin, but he didn't dare stop. He could hear Vecra's footsteps behind him, steady and powerful, a constant reminder that they weren't in this alone. The storage building had been a temporary refuge, but now it was only a distant memory. Their time there had been too short, and the danger was far from over. The Bounty Guild was relentless, and the pursuit wouldn't stop until they had both captured or eliminated them. They darted through the back alleys of the city, keeping to the shadows. Zane could hear the faint sound of engines in the distance. The bounty hunters were getting closer, closing in on their trail. It wouldn't be long before they were surrounded, but Zane had no plan, no real idea of where to go. All he knew was that they had to keep moving. They had to survive. "We need to get to the safe house," Vecra said, her voice low but firm, breaking through the silence between them. Zane nodded, though he had no idea what she meant by safe house. It was a term that seemed to carry weight, something important, but Zane wasn't sure if it was a place of refuge or another trap. "Where is it?" "2 blocks away." "I've been there before," she replied, her voice full of certainty. "It's secure. We can regroup there and figure out our next move." Zane didn't question her. He had no reason to doubt her judgment. He had learned to trust Vecra, even when everything around them seemed uncertain. She had been his ally in ways that went beyond fighting. She had kept him grounded when he felt like everything was falling apart. And now, with danger closing in, it was his turn to trust her completely. They reached the corner, and Zane glanced over his shoulder. No sign of the guild yet, but he could feel them coming. He didn't have the luxury of time. Vecra tugged on his arm, urging him forward, and they took off down the next street, running as fast as they could. The safe house wasn't far, but every step felt like it took an eternity. They reached an old, weathered building at the edge of the city. It was a nondescript structure, blending in with the other abandoned warehouses in the area. Vecra led the way, her movements precise, like she had done this 100 times before. They slipped inside through a side door, and the heavy metal door slammed shut behind them with a resounding thud. The inside of the safe house was dimly lit, but Zane could see enough to make out the various supplies stacked against the walls. Food, water, weapons. It was a place meant for survival, a place meant for hiding. But Zane couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe yet. Vecra went straight to a small table in the corner, pulling out a map and spreading it out in front of them. Her eyes scanned the lines and symbols, searching for their next move. Zane watched her closely, his chest tight with worry. This wasn't just about running anymore. They had no more time to hide. The guild was out there, and they would keep coming until they had Vecra in their grasp. "We can't keep running," Zane said, his voice steady despite the unease that gnawed at him. "We have to fight back." Vecra didn't look up from the map. "You're right, but we need a plan. We need to be smart about this." Zane's mind raced as he looked around the room. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And they had Vecra's skills. That alone gave him hope. He had seen what she was capable of, and for the first time since the bounty hunters had started chasing them, Zane felt like they had a fighting chance. "I'm in," he said, his voice stronger now. "Whatever it takes. I'm not running anymore. We're going to stop them." Vecra's eyes met his, and for the briefest of moments, Zane saw something in them. Something like pride, maybe even gratitude. "Good," she said, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "We fight together. We finish this." The silence in the room was thick with anticipation. They had a plan now, a purpose. The guild might have been hunting them, but they weren't just prey anymore. They were a force to be reckoned with. Zane wasn't sure how they would do it, but he knew one thing. They would stand their ground. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The fight for their lives and their future was far from over, but they weren't alone in it anymore. They had each other, and with that, they would find a way to win. With a final, determined look, Vecra rolled up the map and stashed it in her bag. "Let's move," she said. And with that, Zane and Vecra stepped out of the safe house and into the night, ready to face whatever the Bounty Guild had in store for them.